Thought I'd kick off today talking around infrastructure as code. There's been a lot of work going on behind the scenes here at Megaport to refresh some of our API properties, some of the way that you get started in using those. And if anyone's been watching, hopefully some of the viewers have been watching with eagle eyes, the GitHub repositories that we publish, there is actually some Terraform upgrades that are in progress. We're just about to release a 1.0 on that after many years of being in a very pre-release phase. So fantastic for those customers that have been working with our APIs and with the Terraform code to date. There's been an absolutely renewed interest. So it's probably fitting that I do a quick intro. My name is Jason Bordujenko, or JB. It's much easier than saying Bordujenko 3 times twice, trust me, or spelling it. And I'm joined, as Dave said, by Kiminamoto Tadaka, and he is our solution architecture expert in Tokyo. So the team, as you've probably met Mark, if you were on the long form webinar, or any other of the team that have presented these drop-ins, work with customers directly on a day-to-day basis, taking them through the very many aspects of the Megaport service offering. I thought I'd hit the reset button a little bit today. I don't have a slide deck for you, just for something different, given some of the great feedback that we've got. These tabs that I have on the browser in front of me are what I'm going to be taking you through, and we'll actually get to, drum roll please, command line goodness, because that's really what the code bit in infrastructure as code means. If we just spoke solely about the API, I'd probably get people's eyes glazing over, but what effectively are we trying to do here? Well, a little bit of a preview of where we've come from and where we're going to. We have actually just been working on in the background a little bit of a cool architecture article that we're going out shortly, and that's what I'll be covering today. So I'm not going to give you the URL for this. We're going to get started with using the API, and this document will be creating this instance, so a Megaport Cloud Router, or MCR, connected to 2 different cloud environments. So this article will be coming out soon, and I'd be certainly subscribing to our updates and the LinkedIn pieces. You'll see that shortly. We won't be doing the cloud instances today, but as part of working through this article, it's highlighted some of the changes that have happened recently to the way we handle authentication and just getting started with these code snippets. So most of you are probably familiar, I will hope. If you haven't already logged in to the Megaport portal, you can do so today. So I have a login here that I can use, but if you don't have a login, you've got a couple of steps below that blue continue button there. So if you already have a company and you want to represent that company, they're already a Megaport user, clicking on join your company account will take you to our documentation page. And that tells you the step-by-step manner that the company admin or the account owner can actually add you as part of that existing environment. But where a lot of our DevOps community gets started is that they actually want to trial these services in a way that isn't going to impact any production services currently online that may have already been spun up using the API, or potentially using just the portal. So there are ways to do that. And the first step is actually to get a login. There is a slight delay in the next step, but I want everyone to get that login running straight away, and then we'll explain the process to get that login transferred to the environment. We call it the staging environment. So if you don't currently have a login, you can do so just by clicking, no surprises there, how do I get a login? And I can go through a step there to create that with my email address. It does require you to state an affiliation. That might be the company that you're working on behalf of, or if you're contracting to that company, certainly it would be useful to know that. It won't actually drop you into their account automatically by providing that. That needs to be that invitation process that I spoke about earlier. If you do make the wrong click and you need to go back in and then you say join your company account, it will take you through that workflow that you can share with your admins to make that happen. Now, when you do log in, what you will be presented with is probably a blank portal at that point in time. Now, in the great demo environments, here's one I prepared earlier. We're actually now over in the staging environment, and the URL for that, instead of just portal.megaport.com, is portal-staging.megaport.com. And I can tell that I'm sitting in the staging environment not only by that banner image, but that little line of text underneath. This is a non-production environment. So if you're net new, you've just started up and you're getting going with using Megaport, you won't see any of these services down below. So I'll just call this drop in for today. So this is what you'll see, no matching services. It's a nice clean slate to get started with. And what we'll be doing in API is effectively using command line requests to authenticate ourselves, and we'll be using curl, which I think is probably not a programming language is the best way to describe it, but it's something that everyone who's getting started with infrastructure as code begins with. We do have some documentation that I wanted to point out before we get started. I won't be referencing it in great detail today, but it's a really great reference part in case you get stuck before needing to ring one of the solution architecture team or the support teams. They're mostly on the side of those that have deployed services, but the getting started, we actually document fully end to end. And that site is here. It's dev.megaport.com. You don't need a login to access this site. You can start reading about all of the capabilities. And practically, it's probably appropriate to say anything that can be done in the point and click part, the portal itself or the staging environment, we will document in this environment to show the particular prerequisites, the command lines, and those flags that are required to specify. But we do get a lot of feedback. We do get a lot of feedback that getting started beyond just getting a login can be a little bit daunting. Usually it's fine to say, I know if I press the button in the portal that says create MCR, I understand that will create an MCR. But usually with infrastructure as code or coding to the API, it's those first couple of steps. How do I get an authentication token that's not my username and password? That was the previous way that we utilized to log in. And now we've moved to an API key-based environment. That's actually the first step of the documentation, generating access keys. And we want to move into that pretty quickly so we can cover that today in our 30 minutes. This environment, as I said, is pretty good for reading the documentation, but you'll notice on the right-hand side, it's even better that it actually gives you the examples of what you need to make these things happen. Now, for those of you who are going, don't know about curl, there's a couple of options to you at this point. At the top right, you'll see a button that says Run in Postman. Now, if you've done any API development work before, that's an environment that will install into your browser. It does require another login to the Postman service, but it allows all of the code snippets that exist here and are shown on the right-hand side in that dark background. It allows them to be almost point and click within the browser. We're not going to be using Postman today. We'll be doing that, as I said, solely in the command line and referencing some of these pieces of documentation. I will pause before we go and start running some of these, though, that we're not just here to talk at you today. This is real live people doing real live demos. We'd like to do these live. And that also goes the other way. If you do have questions, I would love you to feed them into the chat, please. If you're on Zoom, the Q&A function, as Dave mentioned at the top of the hour, please use that. Drop any questions that you may have relating to the API or any other of the Megaport services. Do that in there. Otherwise, if you're in LinkedIn, it's simple as just adding a comment to that, and Dave will feed that back into the system that we're in to make the chat live for you. So I do have it on good authority that we have a couple of good giveaways, and we will be looking at maybe the top one or two today. The top questions will get hopefully a t-shirt or something awesome. So back to where we were on the development documentation. As I mentioned, we'll be using curl. If that's not your particular flavor, there's actually a really cool functionality here that you can convert any of those commands are translated into the different languages. So simply by clicking on that, it will show the equivalent of what we'd use in curl at the command line interactively to something that you could then implement in any of the other libraries. If you've got JavaScript, if you've got C#, for example, there's a large variety to choose from. I don't need to speak all of these languages because it will be translated for me. So step number one, let's go and get an access token. That's the key. We'll actually start that, interestingly enough, in the staging portal. So where to do that? Once I've logged in and I have access to that portal, in the tools menu at the bottom, I can see a option which is API key generator. Now yours probably isn't full of keys that are existing. Interestingly, I created one prior to today, and although it gives me the key, it won't give me the associated secret. So if you're used to developing on cloud environments, it's a very similar environment that I need to stand up a new key in order to actually get that secret. It's only a one-time shown option. So I'll call that JB drop-in demo, and then I associate that to a role. And there's only two roles available at the moment. That is company admin, which has obviously write access. It can create or destroy particular aspects of the service. And there is a read-only option as well. So if I just wanted to use it in a knock type role and I wanted to pull statistics off particular parts of the property that I'd set up using Megaport, I can do that by creating a key that wouldn't have any of those create or destroy rights. Token expiry, in this case, if I look at the little tooltip, you can set a minimum of 5 minutes, so short-lived keys, all the way up to a 24-hour key. So if you're putting this in programmatically, the key needs to be generated in such a way that you'll be able to come back and refresh against that. The key itself will be consistent beyond the 24-hour point, but the token that it generates, we call them bearer tokens, they will be available for longer. It just needs a refresh using the keys that are created. So let's click on generate key and we'll go and build that. So automatically we're responded with a key and an API key secret. Note there, you won't be able to regenerate or see that again. So it is important that you grab it. I'm happy to share this one. I'm not going to be using it in today's example. I will use another one, but as I said, this is in our staging environment. So none of this is going to build to a real service. But what are our steps now? Okay, so if I come back to the documentation, the first one is we need to make the request for that bearer token, and that is done towards our identity provider, which is known as an IDP. And we are using Amazon's Cognito service. So that's actually our first requirement. We'll move over now to the terminal. And as I mentioned, we're publishing a document on this. So once we have that key and the secret, we can simply use the copy and paste, which is a great functionality. And we'll paste that in there to the command line. Now, for this documentation, that key is not a valid key. We actually need to come back in and edit that. But this command line is actually quite valid for what we're doing. So where is the next step of this? I need to utilize this command and provide my key. So I'd put, if I copied and pasted it, I'd put my API key in this step, a colon, and then my API key secret in this next step. And these aren't obviously the real values. We didn't grab them from before, but if I then hit enter, I'll be presented with a bearer token. Now, interestingly, a bearer token is just a very large hash of values, and this is one that I've generated for the demo using that previous step. So it will return that bearer token. But what I can do is, now that I've got that copied into my buffer, I'm able to use that on the subsequent commands. So we've got the first step done, which is creating the key. The second step is then retrieving that bearer token, and obviously the validity of that will be set to that timer that I selected back in the portal. All right, so what are we going to do with that as our first step? Well, if I'm going to look at that article, the first thing that makes sense to me is to look at all of the locations and all of the services that Megaport offer. So if we think of doing this through our staging portal, let's do it interactively first. I'm going to be wanting to build an MCR in this example. So let's click on Create MCR. And of course, the first screen that I get back is returning all of the various locations that I could potentially build that in. So this shows me all of the locations that have an MCR available. Happens to be the one that I'm going to be building in the demo in Frankfurt. And then I get the options of that. So 1, 2.5, 5, and 10 gigabits per second. So how can I do this interactively on the API? Well, we can utilize, as part of that documentation, a curl command, which will look up the particular location that we require. So I'll just grab that, which uses that bearer token that I mentioned before. And this is solely going to request the locations that have a status and is active in the Frankfurt metro. So that did scroll past pretty quickly, but we get that list of those locations and all of those capabilities. I did do this earlier, so let's just grab that in a way that we can interrogate it without it scrolling past. So I'm now going into a text editor, and I can see by scrolling through, these show the ports that are available at those sites, and it will show things like MCRs and the associated speeds. So here we can see MCR version 1, available speeds, MCR version 2, available speeds, and as I mentioned there before, we have 1, 2.5, 5 gig, and 10 gig. What's important to move ahead though is this value here, and this is covered in the documentation. So ID equals 130. 130 is the specific identifier for this particular site. So let's scroll up, obviously past all of the different capabilities, and we can see the site is the intersection site here in Frankfurt. All right, so let's bring that forward. If I was doing this in the portal, where would I see that? If I go back, and we filter here by Germany, we can see the different sites that are available. So this particular one here would map to that location 130, which is great. If I want to then go and build an MCR, I can do so. I can specify 1 gigabit per second, return the pricing that's available to me, and then I can configure it and go and press enter. Let's do that with command line. So back to here, we know that it is location 130. And what are we going to be building next? So again, we'll come back to the documentation. So we've shown that site has those available options. And the first step that we want to do in terms of building an MCR is actually checking that the resources exist and that it is valid. It would be that return of pricing stage, although as I mentioned in the staging environment, there's no pricing impact. So for this particular requirement, we need to run two steps. The first one is a design call, so network design and then validate. And then that is followed by a network design and a buy call. And both of those particular configs you'll notice are the same. So what are we using for the config? In this particular one, this is a product name or an MCR that's called Stack Exchange MCR. It's a type MCR2. It is 1 gigabit per second, sorry. And the AS number is the Megaport default that you might have seen on that previous screen, 133.937. All right, so let's go and grab that code with our token in it. So we want, in the first step, will be a validate call. I'll just grab that. And we'll come back now into the command line. We'll clear that out. So we start from scratch. I'll paste that in. So just looking at above, we actually have this as a validate step. I won't double click, otherwise it'll paste it again. The bearer token, as I mentioned, and then we're utilizing a set of stanzas which has the location ID and the details of what we're ordering. Now, the only thing that I'm going to change here is the product name, because we are filtering in the portal view of drop-in. So drop in, and we'll again use the 1 gigabit per second MCR2. Okay, so that's a good result for us. We can now see that that has passed validation. It's given us all the details that we need for the pricing of that as well. We accept those, we understand the terms, we know that this is in Frankfurt. What do we need to do to actually make that happen on the network? Obviously, if I went back to the staging portal at this point in time, that wouldn't have actually ordered it, but now I'll change that call from a validate call. Nothing else is changing. And I'll change that into a buy call. And you can see that at the top of that line that's highlighted. All right, so it's got all of the same information, location ID. We do need to now change that Stack Exchange to drop in though, because I just took that from our copy and paste. So drop in. And by running that, we should get a identifier that says that this has been purchased. All right, and that's a good response. So beyond that, we get a whole lot of other details that are available and obviously would be visible in the portal if we went there. Things like the rate type monthly. It's currently in deployable status. That means it's going off and building that resource. But most importantly, down the bottom are these two final messages. So MCR has been created, and obviously we need to comply with the acceptable use policy on that resource. Great. I've clicked the buttons, I've pressed go, and it says it's done something. How do I go and validate that? Glad you asked. Let's go back to our staging environment because this has been interacting on that. And if we hit refresh on this page now, ensuring that, as I said, the demigods have been well fed today, we should see that drop in MCR, and it's already moved from that deployable status into green, which means that's up and running. So all I need to do to confirm is this my correct one. It's not someone else that has found drop in as a title. Is this here? That's our service identifier. So where that says 2F7DE32C, that should match that value that we saw on the command line, which is great because that's now the primary key or the token that would identify this particular resource. So that's about our 20-minute run through that I've aimed for, and leaving some time for questions at the end. But ideally, this was to take you through those steps to create the MCR. What I did want to show you, though, as a takeaway from today, obviously, is to tease that we have some documentation to come up, particularly for AWS connecting through to Azure using the MCR in the middle. If I was to want to know more and to build that as an example, I could do so. I could just click on AWS and obviously start building through there. But the inquisitive minds would be able to then follow along what's happening in terms of those particular commands. So the documentation that I spoke about. Again, where do we find that? So if I come back here and now I've turned on the inspector. So let's go back to the screen. So I'll just make sure that I'm still logged in. And when I click on the AWS creation, we should see those requests that are actually coming up to my right. So building out the location requests and then building out AWS an AWS connection. If I type hosted connection, we will see that progressively populate on the right-hand side, the pane that actually shows. So we've got that locations call there. And it is possible then to look at these particular calls. The responses will be the same as we were getting in the command line, but as you step through those, you'll be able to map those to the API documents that I spoke about, so dev.megaport.com. So what we're doing here is a cloud connection. We're doing that from an MCR, and in that case, I was using Azure, and we've been stepping through these requirements. So looking up AWS hosted connection in the case of what I was using there, and the examples are given there. I won't be going to run them line by line as they require a little bit more config than I have prepared for today, but you can see those requirements to step in and start building those live. So it is quite a interesting process if you're familiar with building via the portal to actually watch those calls that are against the API requests. As mentioned, the environments are key. So if you do come back to our documentation, at the very, very start, you'll see the 2 server environments. So just making sure that api.megaport.com, that is pointing towards the live production environment. Generally, users getting started will be testing in staging. As I mentioned, just as the total recap of today, start by going to the Megaport portal, which is our production environment, portal.megaport.com, registering an account. That won't be available straight away in staging. You will be able to log in. It will take you through that setup process, but within about a day, that account will have cloned into our staging environment. And you'll know that that's available for your use and for the testing simply by logging into portal-staging.megaport.com. Once that's up and running, as I mentioned, those services, any of those that are created with this yellow banner, are free of charge. There's no real impact on a live network. So even connecting here to AWS, it will show that the connection is progressing, but it won't actually build a live service. So let's do that very briefly. We can see pricing, we can agree to those terms, we can move ahead, we can provide an account ID, and it will actually execute. It will buy. Here I've just done a validate stage and an order, but it won't be building to AWS in the real world. You won't see it received on the AWS console, nor for any other cloud services. It's simply emulating those steps that you'd be building on the Megaport portal and allowing the testing to progress such as you were building it in the API. So I think that's given us about 5 minutes to go, and we've covered all the territory that I'd endeavored to cover in 25 minutes. I'll pause there and hand over to Kimmy, and we'll see if there's any Q&A that's dropped in. Kimmy.
Oh, okay. We have one question. Then
Mm,
one of the question is that do we have to follow the same step for the to connect to any other cloud like GCP environment or AWS? That's the
mm.
question.
So in general, they're very, very similar steps, but it's a good question because each one is slightly different depending on the requirements of that provider. So in this case, looking at the hierarchy, this is again in the documentation, depending on what you're connecting from. So if I was connecting from a port, we can see that there's certain options that are well documented there. So I can see Alibaba Cloud, AWS, Azure, Google, and others. In this instance, I was using the MCR example. So they're the top 3 that are documented. It doesn't mean that the other options are not available. It means that is solely that we will document, for example, the AWS specific requirements to connect from an MCR. The variations that are required from a port are less. So there's less inputs that are needed. But to that question, if the customer was looking at Google Cloud, the workflow would be the same. They'd still do lookup. In this case, Google has a pairing key. So it would utilize this process to go to Google and query that pairing key. The steps here would then be to actually create that VXC, and the requirements would be stipulated in that API documentation. But it's a great question, and hopefully that's covered in the documentation. If you don't find what you're looking for, that's a great time to engage one of the solution architecture team to have a discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, JV. We have another question. I think
Mm,
you just answered it, but
sure.
the question is that the API method you just explained is applicable for other
Mm.
Megaport products, like
Yes, absolutely. So I showed that very briefly. I didn't go into great detail here, but anything that can be done in the portal is using our API. We're actually consuming those public API endpoints. Not every single one of them is documented in the same way or the same depth, and that's what I'm representing here, talking about the differences of what we see in port versus MCR. All of these endpoints can be connected, but in case of, let's say, Oracle Cloud, there might not be some of the same amounts of automation with MCR that there are on other providers. So it's still possible to connect to any of those. And hopefully the question that flows from that, if it's not documented, I can still get to what those commands are by using the developer tools. So I'm using Chrome here, and if I switch developer tools on, I'm going to filter for API staging, and then any of those commands that I use, say plus connection, I'll go to cloud and I'll pick on Alibaba in this case. And we can see there that there's requests that are being sent to Alibaba. So it is possible to actually step through anything that you can do in the portal simply by filtering for where we're sending that request. So there's a lot of things that are going on in web properties, as you can imagine, but anything that we're sending to the API staging server will be referenced here. And you can actually step through that. And then I can use curl. I can actually even go into here and say, copy that as curl. So those specific requests that your browser is making, I can then emulate them on the command line. I just need to substitute that bearer token, the authentication, because it doesn't have the context of who I am that the browser would. Good question though, thank you.
Thank you very much, JV. You answered all of the questions we have. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, we might wrap it up there. If there's no other questions, I'll give everyone a minute if they want to throw something back in the chat or into LinkedIn. Hopefully that was valuable. As I said, it is a big undertaking to get through getting started with API in a 30-minute session, but it gives a good overview of the services that Megaport have available. And really the takeaway to today was getting you started with the staging environments, knowing that if you already were using API keys with our older style, the login and password, we now moved to a bearer token environment, so where to get that, and then obviously how to get access to that documentation that makes it super simple. So thanks for your time, and we look forward to seeing you on these regular weekly sessions. Cheers.
Excellent. Thank you, JB. Thank you, Kimmy. We do have a couple of comments that are coming through on LinkedIn, and I will pass them through to you, Kimmy and JB, shortly afterwards. We can help those people out with those questions there. But again, big thanks, JB. Thank you, Kimmy. We will be here same time, same channel next Friday for our tech drop-ins. You can watch live via LinkedIn, or you can register and watch via Zoom. Thanks again. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you all next week.
See you all.